picture made rounds of the internet of an old Greek man sitting next to a cash machine, clutching his worthless pension card and crying because the government cut pensions. This is symptomatic of Greece as a whole, a country on the ropes, utterly destroyed by debt. A country where national debt is 380% of GDP. A country where 1 in 2 people who are young have no job. The consequences of debt are unconscionable, and that's why we would forgive Greek debt. So what is Greek debt? We're talking about over 1 billion debt owed by Greece to international creditors. Most of these creditors are from the European Union, most prominently nations like Germany, Luxembourg, and Finland. What is our model? First of all, we believe that creditors should forgive all Greek debt, meaning that they will have no obligations on repayment on the current money owed. This will obviously be a one-time offer, meaning that future debt will still be subject to repayment conditions. Third, we are amenable to more loans being given to Greece in the future, but with proper risk assessment rather than what was done in the past. This model is a track record of success in Poland and Germany, where debt was cancelled in the wake of the Second World War, and it's helped to spur economic development and the establishment as international powerhouses. We're going to forward 3 arguments on side proposition. First of all, that we have a duty to cancel Greek debt. Secondly, the outside saves Greece. And my second speaker will tell you why we aid international economics. First argument, that we have a duty to cancel this debt. The first of this argument is that creditor countries have a moral obligation to cancel Greek debt. Let's start with the premise that much of Greek debt is incurred from the euro or organizations internationally linked to European countries. In particular, we believe the European project and the Eurozone was about sharing responsibilities and sharing obligations. We think that nations should bear the brunt and hence cushion this Greek debt, because the euro was founded on the principle that the biggest burdens fall on the broadest shoulders. No, thank you. That's why we have schemes for sharing aid relief or sharing refugee obligations, for instance, because there is recognition that part of the European project is about sharing common aspirations. It's about cushioning the weakest nations and the weakest members. Nations such as Germany and France are better pleased to absorb the debt burden as creditors. We would rather the German taxpayer lose money than the Greek pensioner. Why is that so? Because the former is better able to cushion the tax burden, as his government has the infrastructure to support him. So there's the welfare programs that will ensure that he can survive. The latter has no such support. And as a consequence, we believe that since the Eurozone was about sharing obligations, and since the European project was about sharing obligations and responsibilities, the European countries have a principal obligation to cancel Greek debt. Moreover, if opposition supports any kind of economic restructuring or debt restructuring, they concede to this because they admit that some cost to German taxpayers is conscionable if we can cancel, or if we can rather benefit Greek individuals. Moreover, we think that even outside of the euro, loans made irresponsibly to Greece were made under ill-informed circumstances. We think that many creditors, both within and outside of Europe, lent to Greece knowing that there was a possibility of default, or knowing that there was a possibility that Greece would not be able to pay back that amount. For example, French and German creditors continued to buy Greek bonds in full knowledge that public spending already exceeded EU limits by 30%. As a consequence, many of the creditors of Greece accepted the possible cost and the possibility that Greek taxpayers will not be able to pay back these loans. And as a consequence, we think that they should bear the moral obligation of forgiving Greek debt. That's why it's morally legitimate. Yes.
The reason that Greece is in the problem it is because of its left-wing government that continue to hand out things that the citizens didn't necessarily need. Why do other nations have to carry the costs for those decisions?
We think, as I'll show you later, that the Greek government presently has very strong structural incentives to reduce their debt and cut back on public spending. But it can't do so right now because it is saddled by a massive and impossible to absorb debt burden. I'll want to establish this later and I'll flag it out for you. So, actually, I'll go on to it now, on my second argument about how we save Greece. The thrust of this argument is that Greece cannot possibly afford to undertake structural reforms with the huge debt burden it has incurred. And the only way we can allow Greece to move forward economically is to cancel its debt. The alternative to debt forgiveness, and the alternative that Syriza is currently pursuing, is a very painful austerity program. The consequences most often are foisted on ordinary people. We're talking about things like taxes on food and medicine being raised by 23% to accommodate government spending. We're talking about cutting pensions for many Greek pensioners substantially, even to the point of zero. We're talking about cutting public sector jobs without any kind of unemployment benefit to cushion many of the individuals who have lost their jobs. We think these are huge unconscionable harms that are borne by an austerity program. Moreover, within the current problem is that debt perpetuates a debt trap, where Greece has to continue borrowing more and more money to pay for the cost of economic or structural reform. Therefore, within the debt means that Greece cannot reform itself without significant cost to its own people, because it is so strapped of funds due to international debt obligations. If opposition suggests that we're going to restructure this debt, or we're going to make it so that Greece can repay it in installments, that's terrible. Why? Because Germany and other creditors have imposed huge conditions on Greece for the restructuring of debt. For example, Germany's imposed reforms were shown to require Greek firms to cut back below the minimum wage in order to continue hiring individuals. Therefore, Greek debt is resulting in unconscionable harms onto the Greek people. Moreover, we think the worst possible consequence, and something they have to deal with, an incredibly likely one, is that of a Greek default. We know for a fact that Greek citizens already voted against austerity, and the decision to undertake it was made personally by Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras. As a consequence, without austerity, Greek default is entirely likely, given that the vast majority of Greek citizens already don't support austerity, and it's not likely to happen going into the future. The consequences of Greek default are similar to debt forgiveness, because it means that creditors don't get their money back, but without all the benefits to Greece of having more capital, for instance, of having money in their banks. What they have to countenance with is the possibility of a Greek default, which will still obviate all creditor funds. I think that default is obviously bad because Greece will have zero credit rating, it will leave the euro, and lead to an investor exodus. Those are the consequences that they have to deal with. The only way we can hope to implement lasting structural reforms in Greece is to cancel their debt. Why is that so? Because banks, in a moment, now have capital to finance reform. Yes?
Okay, so you have the political capital to prevent people from paying off debts completely. Surely we have it to make austerity measures better than the way that they've been implemented before.
We think that austerity measures, systemically, regardless of how they are spent, result in massive harm to the Greek people, because it's about cutting back government spending. It's about reducing the kind of services that we offer. As a consequence, there is no reasonable way you can create austerity without resulting in the same harms, even if you try to, the Greek government will still cut back on public spending in a similar manner. So, okay, on our side, governments can fund retraining programs for workers because they have more funds, because the kind of capital created still exists when we forgive debt. Why will Greece restructure their economy rather than be fooled into a moral hazard? Here's where I respond directly to their first point of criticism. First of all, because our model is a one-time offer, meaning that we don't continue to sponsor or we don't continue to endorse irresponsible behavior on Alexis Tsipras' behalf. Moreover, there are harms to cumulative debt even if it is forgiven. It means things like lower investment confidence, plummeting output, that result in the Greek government having a strong incentive to restructure their economy rather than to continue to spend irresponsibly. So we think the Greek government on our side has perfectly good reasons to continue reform. In fact, we think that forgiving debt worked in a lot of developing countries. Under, for example, the highly indebted poor country scheme in Africa, where we forgave the debt of countries like Kenya and Tanzania, spurring the equivalent kind of economic reform. The same kind of reforms we want to see in Greece. As a consequence, we save Greece from an uncertain future, and that's why we are very proud to do this.
What our political structures might suggest, Singapore in today's debate needs to toughen up. Because the truth is that allowing more leniency in a policy when the countries that we're talking about has specifically made irrational and bad decisions that have led to bad economic policies is only going to result in a disaster. We're going to prove 4 things to you today's debate. Firstly, I'm going to clash with all of their matter and talk to you about how Greece can still pay back their debts and can still rebound economically. Secondly, I'm going to ask the question about what is best for the EU in today's debate, who we're assuming this House is, and who is ultimately the most important actor. And then thirdly, I'm going to be speaking about what allows the most immediate recovery. Stephen is then going to speak to you about harming the progression of the incentives that we have currently seen Greece undergo. The first question, and all my rebuttal is going to be integrated there, is can we principally still allow Greece and ask Greece to pay money back? Because we have to ask here what the reasons are behind Greece's economic issues. Proposition would have you believe that it is entirely the fault of austerity, and that the reason that Greece is in this debt crisis is because we have had extremely strict austerity measures on things like minimum wage, on things like pensions. What we would tell you, though, is that in reality it has been a combination of two factors. One is incredibly bad economic decisions made by the Greek government itself. So we had incredibly high pensions, higher than anywhere else in the rest of the world. We have incredibly high minimum wage. We had very low retirement ages, which meant that capital and the businesses and the people couldn't generate their own funding, and that's why they needed to borrow so much of it from other countries. It's the government's fault, not as much as it is any others. Secondly, we admittedly saw a bad implementation of austerity, right? So the taxes that were implemented were too high and too strict. What's important here, though, is that both of these things can be fixed. Because the truth is that the EU's incentive structure is not to cripple Greece. Right? It's still going to be part of that union, and it's still going to play a part in the existence of the way that that union functions. That means that increasingly we are actually seeing a trend towards this. We both received some sort of acceptance from Greece to accept austerity measures, right? We've seen it from the people in the referendum that just occurred. So thank you. Secondly, though, we just say that there's a way better option in terms of the way that we implement austerity. We can lower taxes, we can prevent the harms they're talking about, but we can also result in economic policies that aren't disastrous and illogical, like the kind of incredibly high pension wages that we've been seeing at the moment. We are also very happy to extend deadlines if Greece is going to default on those deadlines in the immediate future. What they need to prove to us in today's debate is that even if we accept that at any point in the near future, or even at any point in the extended future, Greece could be able to pay back those deadlines and pay back the money that they borrowed, we would accept that. They have to prove to us why it's never going to happen and why it's always going to be harmful in every single case. That's just not true. Look at the fact that Ireland was able to recover through the same austerity measures. So given that, the first question we then have to ask is what is better for the EU? And this responds directly to all of their analysis about the principal obligation that the EU has to, like, foregoing this debt. So firstly to that, we just say the purpose of the EU is not to allow countries who are doing badly or who are poor economically to uplift themselves entirely, right? It's a mutually beneficial union. That is the point of it. And so that we just say that that doesn't mean that you as a person living in Germany has every single obligation to pay your taxes, to work, so that people in Greece can somehow be benefited. They need to do a lot more work to show that someone who accepted a measure that was perhaps going to help a fellow European, but accepted it in the confidence that they were going to get paid back, now has the obligation to pay them back entirely and never to accept anything else as a result of that. We say that that's fundamentally, and I'll take you in a moment, fundamentally illegitimate. We would never force that choice on people. Yes?
You want to be nice to Greece in austerity measures, and you also want to postpone deadlines again and again and again. How's this person getting back this money on your side of the house?
Okay, so at least they're getting that back the money at some point in the conceivable future, right? We accept that yes, you still have to be rational, and you still have to weigh up what is going to be acceptable and whether or not people are actually going to get the money at the end of the day. That's the most important question. We answer it, you don't. Do more work side proposition. The next question there is what facilitates, no thank you, what facilitates better economic policy decisions for the EU as a whole? And this significantly harms them. Why? Well, firstly, it damages their access to capital and investment because as an investor option, it makes them look far more shaky. And this is really important because when the body of EU, and the EU, by the way, also has to prioritize all of its other members, right? So it has to prioritize Spain and Italy and other countries that are also suffering economically. We're not just looking at Greece in that. And in that kind of situation, it's really important that they have access to spending capital, they have access to investor confidence, and they have the access to be able to make their own economic decisions. They can't do it if they're perfectly happy, and I'll take you in a moment, to pay back bonds and therefore seem unreliable to all of those investment opportunities that are really important at the moment for every single member.
If the government is so unsound, so irrational, and so structurally bad, why wouldn't it leave the Eurozone or just default?
Okay, so that's also not necessarily what we're saying, right? And in my second speaker, he's going to elaborate on why we get worse economic policies once you allow this kind of leniency. More than that, though, you also have to prove why that's not going to happen under this case. But lastly, even if that did happen, we would still prefer that to all of the detriment that you do to every other member in the EU. You have to respond to this analysis, and the third reason I'm going to elaborate on now. Because essentially, you take away the ability of these countries to be able to make proper economic decisions. Because this debt that Greece owes them has up until now been considered an asset that's important when they make decisions based upon capital that they think they have. When you suddenly tell people that billions of the euros that they thought they once owned are not actually there, that significantly shapes the way that people make policy decisions and cripples their ability to change those kind of policy decisions. Secondly, let's assume that we really did prioritize Greece in today's debate. And here's the next question of how we are going to impact them and how we are going to
information.
Because the truth is, Greece needs to work with the other members in the EU in order for it to ever be able to recover economically, right? Reasonably, in the near future, we're going to need a significant amount of capital, a significant amount of loans, and still bail out in order for the Greek economy to recover. It's not self-sufficient now. It still needs to do so. What's important here, though, is that once you anger those German people, once you anger the investors outside of the EU, and once you say that you as a country, no thank you, are never going to be able to get back on your feet, more than that though, you're unreliable and don't pay your debts, that's the exact thing that prevents you from having access to that kind of capital. It prevents you from having access to things like foreign investment. Because the truth is, the German people who already feel resentful to the money that they paid to Greece, who already feel some sort of anger at the fact that they have had to pay their taxes to people that they don't even know, are going to feel doubly angry the second that you say that they don't ever have to get that money back because it's your obligation as a member state of the EU, right? That is the kind of resentment that you're breeding, and that is the kind of anger that is literally going to result in you never being able to pay Greece back at the end of the day. So the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that when we're looking at economic policy, there always has to be a way out that we would make. We would always prefer a world in which at some point in the conceivable future, we could achieve some sort of recovery. We far prefer that to the one in which side proposition asserts that we should forgive our debts, ignore the past, and move into an uncertain future. I'm very proud to stand beside
So, Team Opposition's shining bright example was Ireland, who would pay back its taxes after not sure how many years. And you know how they did it? By laying off more than half of its workers, by increasing VAT tax so much so that it became so regressive that so many poor individuals took their own lives knowing they cannot even afford medicine and food. If that is opposition's shining example, then they forget the human cost in this debate. The human cost of individuals who are lost at the point in which you implement your hard economic logic on people who are actually alive. Two questions for the House today. One, what are the relevant moral duties involved in this debate? Second, how do we help this? I'll clash directly with the whole argument about the EU in my substantive argument, where I'll show you how we help the international economy. First question, what are relevant moral duties? Their assertion was that they had high minimum wage and high pensions. So, behind this language, what they really are saying is that, oh, we should pay people below the minimum wage. We should significantly cut pensions. And they have. That's why no one is receiving pensions. That's why when you go to an ATM machine, you literally cannot draw more than $80 because there's not enough liquid cash for you to withdraw from the machine. So, we suggest they are already doing this and nothing is working. And we suggest, in fact, cutting it is a terrible idea because it incurs so much cost to individuals. Something which my first speaker brought, they were unwilling to deal with. We need to hear a response in a second. But knowing that there are high minimum wages and high pension rates was the exact logic we brought to it first. Which is why many of these investors did consent to the half to begin with. Because they knew there were high minimum wages. They knew they had your high pension. If they knew it was unsustainable, we argued they consented to this hike. No response. We further argued that there was a sharing of obligations often between EU states. They said, but this doesn't incur harm on individuals. That's not true. Most obligations actually do incur harm onto certain countries. So the Schengen area, for example, in the EU, which helps Bulgarian workers, incurs harm to many of the more developed areas in the EU. But you know why we still have it? Because the EU works on the basis of sharing obligations. No direct response. We need to hear this because this is what the relevant moral duty is. The only response, well, thank you, was that we can extend the deadline. Okay, first, we challenge that this is in fact possible since their whole last 2 minutes about how people are really, really angry in Germany already. So it's a little bit difficult to say they can extend the deadline. Second, this is a debate therefore on compromise, since they are already willing to extend the deadline for Greece. Well, thank you, sir. So our question is very simple. We put to you that at the point in which you accept compromise already, we are going to argue that compromising to the fullest extent is the best idea, since you already compromised a little bit. And let me just put this out there. Even with the highest VAT tax and the highest systems of austerity now, you have to wait about 100 years for money to be paid back. So the relevant moral duty of this debate is not about returning it to the actual taxpayer who loaned the money. Thank you. Because he's probably going to be dead by the time we can even pay any single cent back. So we take the relevant moral duties. Second question, how do we help Greece? So they started with a lie. They said, we can repay it because the referendum said so. Anyone who has read the news will know that everyone in Greece, or the majority of individuals in Greece, voted against the referendum. The only reason Greece took out austerity was because Sri passed did it unilaterally. We suggest that if you believe that this is the case, and if this is true, that means in the next election, he's probably going to be ousted. And it is very likely that the next government will come in and suggest a default simply by winning the election. So, my first biggest mechanism was very simple. At the point in which you put so much pressure on austerity on Greece, default is very likely. You know, their response, we'll deal with this in second speaker. So, let's wait for that a little bit, please.
Sir, the truth is that now the German people don't only have to default on their own debts, but they have to pay back bodies like the IMF, who Greece owes money to as well. How is that a positive obligation?
Okay, fact check. The reason Greece owes money to the IMF is because they had to have bailouts to pay out your debt. So at the point at which you remove your debt, Greece doesn't need to borrow from the IMF anymore. Second, Germany doesn't need to default on anything. So I think that was a little bit of a factual inaccuracy in the pure. So, moving on. So thank you, madam. What about the long term? They said, potentially we can pay back the money in the long term. Let's make it very clear. Their own analysis suggests that Greece will need to borrow more money in order for it to fund itself again. There was the analysis we brought to you in the first speaker, which is that debt is cyclical. At the point in which you do not forgive debt, very often this incurs more and more debt for you to repay. We got no response. They gave a naive assumption that, we just borrow more money to solve our problem. Not true. They said we diminish consumer confidence. That's not comparative. When we forgive a debt, the credit rating remains and stays the same. So investors still continue to have that same credit rating. When you default, which is a likely instance on their side, because they did not respond in first speaker, the credit rating goes to 0. So on the comparative, we keep the credit rating, it becomes 0 on their side, we think consumer confidence exists on our side. No, thank you. Last, they said people have their policies, or countries have their policies based on the fact that Greece is going to pay them back their money. This is just a factual inaccuracy. Many countries in the EU are already moving away from focusing their budget on the money that they loan to Greece, knowing that it's very difficult in any near circumstance that they're going to pay back. So, don't let them get away with lies about how they help Greece. But I'm also going to deconstruct their lies about how they help the EU as a whole in my argument now, about how we aid the international economy. So we accept sometimes, maybe we don't owe moral duties to Greece, but we're also going to prove at the very least you owe moral duties to yourself. First, we prevent a contagion, and this directly deals with the idea of foreign investment, and we'll show you why it will decrease. Austerity plans are highly oppressive, and there is a constant uncertainty as to whether Greece will continue to take it up or not, especially after the recent referendum. The idea of a default is becoming increasingly more prominent. There is huge fear in the investor market that Greece may default, causing large economic shockwaves across the European region, such as diminished labor transfer, which can often lead to an increase in costs. Now, here's the important thing. This point does not matter as to whether or not Greece will actually default. So, no matter what the response to default is, it won't matter at this point. The point is, at the moment in which you do not forgive Greece's debt, the option of default always remains open and always remains a possibility in the minds of investors. This uncertainty is what this substantive is about, not the fact that they will default. This instability in the economic framework of the euro severely diminishes consumer confidence, the keyword we wanted to talk about, no thank you, and consequently reduces foreign direct investment. This consequently also hurts other European nations which are also affected by the joint uncertainty since they base themselves on the same currency. So, for example, Since the start of the Greek crisis, hold on a minute, foreign direct investment in countries closely associated with Greece, like Albania and Macedonia, has decreased by 54%. What do you have to say to that?
So now you just extend the uncertainty that they're going to allow other countries, like Portugal, also to not pay back their debts because you've already set the precedent.
Okay, so this is an argument about precedent, not really about uncertainty. This doesn't really deal with this, but we're going to say it's a one-time offer to Greece in a specific circumstance whereby their debt is cyclical in nature, but then has incurred huge human costs they were willing to forgive. So we don't think this precedent argument is really that bad. And if it was such a gratuitous circumstance anyway, perhaps you're willing to forgive it. But let's not forgive it, let's debate for another day. So, moving on, within bailout negotiations themselves in the past 6 months, foreign direct investment across Europe has dropped by over 25% on average. We prevent this uncertainty with a certain move of forgiving debt. So on the comparative, we increase foreign direct investment and increase consumer confidence. Second, you heard imports, because Greece is a key provider of many primary materials to Central Europe. So this great uncertainty casts doubt on the provision of these materials. And that actually hinders these exports because industries are starting to shut down and workers are laid off. In the example of Ireland, exactly the reason. This incurs wider harm as Greece is a gateway port that connects the Mediterranean to the rest of Europe. This hurts huge supply chains from the Middle East and Northern Africa into Greece. So, this not only harms Greece itself, harms the wider European regions, but also harms other countries which are importing into Greece. But put it very simply, we take the moral duty to this debate. We help Greece, we help the wider international community. We stand firm on tea policy.
Greece is currently in the center of a political and economic turmoil. We think that cancelling the debt of an already conflicted nation will not only serve to exacerbate the harms that originally caused the crisis, but also likely to create new ones. We're very proud to say that cancelling the debt of a nation is something that is likely to result in even more of a political and economic maelstrom. Because Greece at the moment is in a position where it's willing to accept austerity. It's in a position where it's willing to compromise on its radical left-wing policies that got it into the problem in the first place. Harming that trend will not only damage Greece in the long term, but also damage more failing nations such as Spain, Italy, and Portugal in the EU. And that's what I'm going to show you in my speech today, my substantive matter. I'm going to be showing you that this is an incredibly harmful precedent to set for the EU and Greece itself. But before that, let's look towards at what Greece is actually looking like at the moment. At the moment, Greece is looking as to be it's in a position where it's functionally willing to pay off austerity, even if that be over a long period of time. It's a position where it's willing to make its concessions in these decisions in order to make sure that it actually results in a final payback. The harm of stopping this trend is that it's likely to revert back to its harms that originally caused this problem. So let's do some rebuttal, in which I'm going to do 2 points. Firstly, I'm going to look as to whether or not we have a moral obligation or a principled obligation to the state. And secondly, I'm going to be looking as to whether or not this is functionally possible and better with Greece. So let's look into whether or not which obligation is placed on which nation. So we think that if we're looking for someone to blame for this crisis, we think principally that blame lies solely on Greece, or at least in the majority of cases, on Greece. We think that it's the votership and the government that had radical government spending, had absurdly low retirement ages, absurdly high pensions and government wages that got itself into this position. They said that we should blame creditors for making bad investments because they didn't have the knowledge in order to make that. We think that this is very simplistic. They were promised returns on the investments that they got. They were promised that the economic situations would improve. They were promised that these radical policies wouldn't last forever, and none of that happened. We think that in this scenario, we're blaming solely on the individuals such as Greece. So we think that this is something that we need to be able to make sense of, and we need to understand that that country itself is in a position to do so. But we also need to look to do substance. Here we're going to be showing as to whether or not this is actually going to be functionally better for Greece in the long term. So what they're telling you now is that Greek people are worse off at the moment, and we think that this is something that's very damaging because of the very draconian austerity that we set up. No thanks. So we think that firstly, it isn't impossible to get better austerity even over a long period of time. So let's respond to what they said about this. They said that this is practically just saying that we're not going to get this payback in a sufficient amount of time, we're not going to get that in an ability. So we think that firstly, Germany and other powerful countries within the EU don't have an incentive to absolutely destroy Greece. They have an incentive to keep it alive. They have an incentive to make sure that it's in a position where its people can work, where it can make back its money, where it can take debt and control to its own cash flow. We think that in its position at the moment, it isn't going to kill Greece with austerity measures because it understands the functional importance of having a nation that's actually able to pay. We also think that the EU's incentive doesn't align in this manner, so we think that we get that benefit. But we also think in terms of paying back people within a set period of time, we think that we would rather have these individuals suggest that they have this paid over a long period of time than not at all. They'd rather have this money within constant cash flow as opposed to never within the immediate frequency. So we think that because Germany have a better incentive to lengthen the austerity measures, as opposed to cancelling completely, we think that they're far more likely to take this line. We also think in terms of investor confidence as to whether or not people are going to invest within a nation. So we think that firstly, after the debt has been forgiven, or if that debt has been removed, within that nation, people are aware of its inability and structural inability to make matters better. They know that there is a potential that that political sphere is going to radicalize. And in my argumentation, I'm going to show you further why that's far more likely, and investors are far less likely to take this ability. But we also think that a safer austerity measure is far better for investor confidence. It means that people, I'll take in a second, are far more likely to accept certain measures than they were in the past.
Should past unilaterally overrode a majority decision not to have austerity? By the end of the next election, you really believe that austerity will still be a trend which people can
So the problem with people of Greece is that they don't like austerity because they like what the government did to them in the past. They like the things that the government gave them because they were really nice and they were free. We think that the people within the scenario aren't in a position to determine what their government should do. Because honestly, the only thing worse than austerity is a Greek exit. And we think that because of the way as the austerity concept is phrased within that position, we think that we should rather prioritize the individual capacity of that nation to make sure that it can improve its own situation as opposed to what the voters want, which isn't something we think is valuable at this point in time. So we think that because this incentive is structurally important for this country, we think that it's important, thanks, that we approve. So let's show you my argumentation why this is a particularly powerful lesson to set, not only for Greece, but also the European Union. The conclusion that I'm going to show you is that this incentivizes similar and even worse economic decisions to what we've seen in the past, not only for Greece, but also other countries in the EU like Spain, Italy, and Portugal, which are currently following the same trend. The importance of this and the strategic importance of this argument is that we don't want to be able to risk a potential domino effect of cancelling debt for an entire nation. We think that this is particularly damaging for them and something that we should try to avoid. If the risk of this happening is high enough, we think that this policy definitely can't get passed. So how is Greece looking at the moment? What is the context of Greece right now? So there's a general trend towards compliance. There's a general trend from the government of the nation to make concessions on the policies that it has in the past. And despite the mixed feelings of voters in Greece, the nation is taking necessary measures in order to make sure that it can pay back the austerity. The problem is that this trend is fragile and is held in place by things like debt, things like the threat of Greek exit and austerity measures. So what I'm going to show you here is that debt facilitates better economic decisions, and without it, we think that it's likely to create significant harms, especially considering the context that they just came out of. So I guess they're right in some sense. The voters are against the anti-austerity and they're pro-big government. They're pro things like pensions. They're pro things like low retirement ages. So the consequences to forgiving debt could be very significant for the political sphere. It allows for the already radicalized political sphere to take control with more rhetoric about very strong left-wing policies. Firstly, they have an incentive to play upon disgruntled voters. They have an incentive to say austerity is very bad. In order for us to get into power, if you vote us in, we'll reduce you to a better concept of, if you want to. We'll have a better concept of whether that person is going to have, whether or not they're going to have, because they didn't like austerity, they're far less likely to control those sort of political measures. But also, the individuals within that station are far more likely to vote for radical political opinions. People can't weigh up these economic decisions. They don't think that a Greek debt crisis like this could happen again. And because they don't have the ability to foresee that in the future, they're far more likely to skew that way. Why is this worse for other EU states? So we think that the other countries that aren't doing so well do have accumulated a lot of a lot of debt at least, they're far more likely to see this as something, they're likely to see this as something that's important for them. So they think that because debt isn't harmful, they're more likely to have a slower response to debt. They're likely to stop it over a long period of time because they know that there's a potential that they could get protected by the EU's economic union, that the EU is willing to compromise within this area, and that's something that they can bank on in their future spending techniques. It also means that they're more belligerent with their debts. They're far likely to push it in front of the EU and push it for over longer periods of time, and thus don't pay back debts within sufficient time. So we think that because the EU doesn't take a strong stance on debt, and because it doesn't control the countries that are unstable, not only do we see an increasing trend towards those countries that are currently in debt being more dangerous, we also think that this is worse for Greece in the long term, not only because it politically results in bad decisions, but also economically. We're very proud to oppose on Team South Africa.
Conscionable. Second, is Greek suffering alleviated? First, on Greek debt. Here are three straightforward reasons why the EU should bear this burden. One, because equity is the foundational principle of the European project. We've begun from the simple principle that the largest burdens should fall on the broader shoulders. And we've told you simply that the German businessman, honestly, needs this money a lot less than a crying Greek pensioner who's been bankrupted and homeless. What did we hear? This is about mutual obligations. I submit those who are paid off and are being paid off right now as we speak. Greece provides Germany with cheap labor, natural resources, a market for low-tier goods. And we've told you that if Germany failed, we'll do the exact same thing. So there's a contractual basis, even on their own matter of mutual obligations, that makes this a very sensible policy. We've told you even further in our first speaker that we do this all the time in refugee redirecting programs so that we split burdens equitably. No response. We said we do this in the Schengen area so that Bulgarians can still find jobs in England and in other areas like Switzerland. No response. We told you even on their own policy, restructuring and postponing, they concede this principle. No thank you. To be sure, Team South Africa wants to defend the sovereign right of a German man to claim his money, but we'll postpone it until it's only his great-great-great-great-grandson who gets the money. We'll make it so gradual and not be too mean to them so that we still have low taxes so that you'll never ever get that money. So honestly, if the comparison is that they get the money back after 500 years because we don't want to be too mean to Greece, I submit that they've considered this principle. As long as we can prove that sufficient harms are dealt, unless we completely write off the program, then we've won this debate. So first of all, most equity is important, they've not touched this. Two, we say creditors consented to the risk. We've told you from the beginning of the debate, no response again, that France and Germany continue buying Greek bonds despite obvious signs like a bloated public sector and public expenditure. And we've said that every loan is a gamble, that people want to keep their eyes open. For the possibility of huge interest rates and profit, they also consent to the risk of default. No response. The only thing they told us is the fault of the individual Greek man. He voted for too many nice things. First and foremost, we said, that's completely right, because Greece is objectively in a poorer economic state than Germany. We don't think it's wrong that they ask for more things to cushion an otherwise really difficult life. But second of all, listen to their argument. They told us that many times voters are ill-informed. And I submit that many times governments mislead people into doing these things because it's nice to hide behind rhetoric of you have a nicer life without austerity. You have a nicer life where we push down the retirement age. No thank you. So we've said that sometimes, we agree with them, sometimes the governments are at fault. We don't think people should bear the brunt of an illegitimate government decision. That's our response to them. So second of all, creditors walked into this contract with their eyes open, they deserve to pay the cost. Third, because Europe benefits from this. So even if they have an obligation to protect European citizens, they should do this as well. No response at all to my second speaker's constructive argument about contagion. No response. About how this hurts imports. No response. About how this leads to a worse possibility of Brexit. Again, no response. So even we concede that our utmost priority is not the starving Greek man, but the bloated paycheck of the German businessman, he's helped by this policy too. So on these three straightforward reasons, there is a conscionable duty and this is our moral burden. Second, is Greek suffering alleviated? Here are three reasons why it is. One, we've asked them, why would the default happen? Listen, their second speaker lied. In the beginning, he said, well, agreed to austerity. Thank goodness, after we gave him a POI, he admitted that wasn't the case. In reality, they have not agreed to austerity. We told you that the Greek voters voted against austerity, first in supporting Syriza, and later quite unequivocally in objecting to austerity in the quite fairly obvious referendum. So by no means is it true or in any way factual that they actually do quite like being subjected to terrible oppression. So we said that if they voted against austerity, when things get tough, why wouldn't they just vote against that and vote to completely default on this sub? And you've heard absolutely no responsibility of their first and second speakers. So no, this takes not the best case scenario, because a lot of that case was based on the claim that Syriza is irrational, it's structurally bad, it makes terrible economic policy. I submit that if all of this is true, that seems to play right into our argument that they will default. So I think that your examples prove exactly our case. And when default happens, all the harms accrue without any of the benefits to the German taxpayer. So first and foremost, we avoid a default, which is all the same harms as forgiveness with none of the benefits. We need a response to that third speaker, but they've not given us one. We think it's too late. Next, we heard the second speaker's constructive argument. This is bad for incentives and the domino effect. Before I go on, yes.
Okay, so reasonably in the status quo, the German people can accept to get their money back bit by bit, even if it's not every single sum. You have to prove why you would prefer your circumstances.
That seems to me to be a fairly bizarre sort of fundamental right. You have the right to property, but only bit by bit, after 400 years. I submit that you conceded half your case at the point you tell us things like that. No, thank you. So, on to the second speaker's constructive argument, the domino effect. First and foremost, they tell us this means they can up their rhetoric. They will say austerity is bad and become radicalized. When do they say austerity is bad? When austerity is happening. Austerity happens when you get to pay off. So I submit that the example proves exactly our side of the case. No, thank you. Next is that we'll give a slow response to that. We said this is a one-time offer. But if they tell us that Portugal is the same, maybe we'll consider it. But we told you that Greece is a special example. Because despite the years and years of slowdown, it's not begun to recover. So fundamentally, these are different. Finally, they said, well, they'll be more belligerent. Again, our example and our argument on defaulting takes all this analysis down. Because if governments are structurally so belligerent and bellicose, they'll just take the easy option, which is not pay back their debt. All the same harms, none of the same benefits. No, thank you. So first and most fundamentally, we avoid all the same harms of default with all the benefits of forgiveness. No response. On this ground alone, I think they lose because they get none of the benefits but all of the harms. Second, we free them from the crushing pressures of debt austerity cycles. The overarching response is we'll be nice to Greece. We'll let them pay back money in their own time. Here are a couple of structural reasons why you can't. One, if you have to pay back this money at all, no thank you. At some point you have to be harsh in austerity measures because it will cut the minimum wage by $5 per year. I submit that that's not going to make a very big difference. For austerity to work, this has to be a sizable cut. No. Two, because of asymmetric bargaining power. At the point that Germany can demand money back on the negotiating table, and Greece is in debt, I submit that Alexis Tsipras or none of his politicians have very much ought to say, no, I don't want to pay this money back, because as they told us, it's a legal obligation. So asymmetric bargaining power means that Germany is just a carte blanche to impose whatever conditions it wants. What are those conditions? We told you in our first speaker, things like cutting wages beneath the minimum wage. Hold on. Third, because of debt cycles, even if each individual conditionality is conscionable, the fact that debt spirals means that you pay on different debts. So conditionalities in aggregation are not conscionable. Yes?
So Germany and the EU don't have an incentive to cripple Greece's economy. It's far more likely to make
Alright,
compromises.
I was going to get to that right now, so I will. Their response is, well, they'll be nice to Greece because of the incentive. One, people are prone to a remarkable cognitive bias called short-termism. Sometimes they do want their money back immediately because they think, well, it's my grandson, I won't be able to see the money ever again. So for some moments that is true. Second of all, Germany and many of its voters actually quite want Angela Merkel to bankrupt Greece so that it drives out the Eurozone. Plenty of people, as you've just told us, actually view Greece as a burden. So I don't think it's true at all that it's incentive to be nice to Greece. They have every incentive to make it so difficult that it leaves. Because Greece currently is seen as a bad weight on the government. So we said austerity is structurally exploitative. And we need a response to them as to why it's alright to drive a pensioner to desperation and to suicide, or to pay a minor between the minimum wage. No response. Third, we also told you in our first speaker that this helps recovery. We said at the point that banks can no longer loan to import services or general corporations. This is bad because it means Greece will never stand on its own 2 feet, or begin exporting so that it can gain revenue, so that it can continue to have a larger public sector and upkeep itself, eventually getting the sort of finances that both teams want to have. Again, no response. So we avoid a default, we avoid the crushing pressures and oppression of austerity, and we also allow long-term recovery. We need responses to all of these arguments because they've been lacking so far in that first and second speaker. So first and foremost, Greek debt is not conscionable, and Greek suffering cannot be otherwise alleviated. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to stand in front of
tough, take it from the developing world. The truth is that whatever policy is implemented regarding Greece, people are going to need to struggle for a while in order for that economy to recover. Today's debate is about choosing to what extent that suffering happens or that struggle happens so that we can result in a Greece that actually recovers in the long term and a Greece that actually pays back the debt it owes to the people in the world. That's what South Africa gives to you today, and that is why we're going to win this debate. This debate comes down to three main questions. One, do Greece have an obligation to pay back this debt, or, by converse, do the EU have an obligation to cover all of Greece's debts in today's debate? Importantly, if this obligation does not exist, that means that even if there is a cost to Greece, it's okay for the EU to not forgive in this case, and that is their right to do so. Second, we're going to look at whether or not this actually is in the interests of Greece, because the truth is that forgiving this debt in the long term certainly is not. And then lastly, we're going to look at what the consequences are for the international community as a whole. Firstly, do they have an obligation? What did they tell us here? They told us that the EU is founded on the principle of sharing and mutuality, and for that reason, they therefore need to they need to cover all of Greece's debts. Here, they seriously underanalyzed what sharing responsibility actually means. Because the EU at the moment is not one where responsibility has been shared. It's where all responsibility for Greece has been covered. Because the truth is that Greece hasn't been pulling their weight. They've been implementing really nice policies that leave pension ages at things ranging from like 54 to 56, which is insanely low, some of the lowest in the world. They've implemented minimum wages so high that they're higher than most of the rest of the countries in the entirety of the EU. Ultimately, in order to ensure this degree of comfort for the Greek people, which was unsustainable, the EU has had to cover them for a very long time. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not sharing responsibility. That is Greece not taking responsibility for their own actions. If you want the EU to uphold its principles, you need to have a situation in which the countries within that body pull their own weight and actually get that mutuality. They tell us that we already get some kind of mutual gain because you have laborers coming from Greece to places like Germany. But here's the truth. That's been covered a long time ago. That mutuality was paid for when Germany and the rest of the nations in the EU gave bailout after bailout after bailout. What they need now is to at least get that money back. If you want mutuality, you need exchanges to be mutual in each case. They paid for that labor, that's out of this debate. If you want a mutual relationship, the money you lend needs to come back to you eventually. That's what the EU stands for, and that's what we're going to give you. But second, even if this principle and what I just told you wasn't the case, it's clear that proposition doesn't buy their own principle anyway. Why do they do this? Because they tell us that the offer that they're going to give Greece is once off and it applies to Greece only, maybe Portugal, but mainly just Greece. Why is that a contradiction? Because if the very nature of the EU means that you constantly need to help each other, then that means even if they make a mistake again, like they have this time, why is it different the second time around? If you have a situation where you have this continued relationship, why won't you help the suffering Greek pensioner next time? You yourself recognize that a line needs to be drawn. What we in South Africa tell you is that that line was drawn after the second bailout, after the third bailout. Time is up, Greece needs to pay back their money. They agree with that principle. So, it is clear then that the EU doesn't have this obligation to pay these individuals back based on this idea of mutuality. In fact, if anything, it means that Greece is obligated to pay the money back to the rest of the EU. The next thing they told us is that the creditors we're talking about knew that this was going to happen. So they saw that Greece was implementing unsustainable policies, and so the fact that they lended to them anyway means that they consented to this kind of scenario. No, that's ridiculous. When they bought into those policies, they were under the belief that they were short-term policies that Greece was going to change. Greece then didn't change them, which means that they didn't consent to the harms that they face now. But moreover, even if they did, they were under the assumption that whatever loans that they granted to Greece were going to be paid back. Giving someone a loan doesn't mean you're consenting to them never giving it back, because there's always that risk. The truth is that these people entered into a relationship where they deserve that money back. Moreover, the obligation that they're trying to propose that you put on the EU is actually one that never stops. Because if you tell nations like Portugal, like Italy, and the rest of those nations in the EU, that we will forgive you at some point if you provide this debt, that's when you're likely to see the people of Greece getting angry when you try time around. Because it worked when we protested last time, let's just do it again until we force you to pay back every single time. We need to set the right precedent at this point, and that is one of actual mutuality, which Greece finally pulls their weight. Go.
Many Eastern European countries were quite irresponsible in managing their economy, resulting in unemployment. Would you abolish the EU common labour market?
Right, no. So maybe. Ultimately what we need to recognize is that this debate is a special case, and we're happy to have that debate with them at some other point. Because the truth in today's debate is that in this instance, Greece went too far, and we therefore would draw the line. If you're going to show us why all of those countries are just as bad as Greece in this case, we'll have that debate, but don't try to impose that on us. We're talking about Greece today. So, now let's take a look at Greece, and here I'm going to talk to you about why this kind of default is in fact, or why this kind of forgiveness, is in fact worse for Greece. And the first thing they told us is that austerity is very harsh. You're going to have people working below the minimum wage. To that we below the minimum wage. To that we say, good. The fact is, the minimum wage is way too high and is higher than anywhere else in so many countries that they need to cut it down in order to have any kind of sustainable economy. Yes, it's going to be hard, but it has to be hard for that economy to ever function. If they want Greece to recover, even without this forgiveness of debt, they too are going to have to cut that minimum wage quite substantially, because we've seen that Greece's economy, as it is now, is never going to work. If you want any kind of progress, cuts need to happen. So the problem is, so what we need to recognize here is that some cuts, and some often serious and difficult cuts, need to happen, but they're in the best interest of Greece in the long term, and they're actually okay. Because there is an incentive to stop at some point. Because there's no reason for the EU to implement something that's going to cripple Greece, make it impossible for them to ever grow. Because then you're right, sir. Because then they only would get their money paid back to them in 400 years. Which isn't what they want. They want installments happening as they move through this process, and for that reason, they have an incentive to allow for enough spending every now and then to generate that growth. That's going to happen. But in terms of a default, what they needed to recognize is that while it's true that people hate austerity at the moment, they've come to accept it because they believe now that it's the only option. The problem and the reason people were rejecting austerity before is because they didn't think it had to be the case. Now you have a government, if they're not allowed to have these debts forgiven, telling the people, look guys, we're stuck with this, we need to do this to move forward. When you have that political narrative, the people are going to buy in. The reason they aren't at the moment is because they believe things like forgiveness are an option, so you're less likely to see those defaults. But ultimately, putting forgiveness on the table at all means that every single time you do this, they're going to try to push for another one, and another one, and another one. Continually forgiving on debts is even worse than a default, because even if you have a couple of defaults, you get that money back eventually. Not in 400 years, but in small installments that are possible for Greece to pay. That is the incentive. Ultimately, life for the Greek people is going to be tough, but it's high time it was. If you want Greece to be saved, if you want the EU to do what is good for them and fulfill their real obligations, you side with South Africa.
to expect. That means that we are going out on that kind of bargain and on that kind of assurance that we make. Secondly, we told you that it's not fair to push on people that they now have to pay back the rest of Greece's debt, right? The debt that Greece owes to bodies like the IMF is not the German people's, and they shouldn't have to pay that back. Secondly, though, we have to ask the question of how we really affect the EU. Because essentially what they told us is that there is a lot of investor confidence that is lacking because the uncertainty holds investors back. So that, we just told you, is not true, because uncertainty is based on a fear that you realize over your side of the house, right? If anything, and this wasn't my argument, you make that uncertainty far worse because you create the precedent that this kind of thing can be true, that the EU can drop every single debt that it ever had, and thus you decrease investment in that body as a whole. More than that, though, you just decrease the access that it as a body has to money. We heard no response. So that means that we already win today's debate because of the overwhelming harms that we do to the EU, who has multiple obligations, not just to one country, not just to Greece. But then let's ask the next question of what we change in Greece and what austerity is reasonably going to look like. Because over and over again, they've lied to you about this overly simplistic picture about what austerity looks like. They talk to you about the sad Greek pensioner who doesn't get any money. But that's not true either. Because the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that it's unlikely to continue like that realistically. Both Greece and countries like Germany and the EU as a whole want Greece to get better. If you can think of arguments as to why the current austerity measures are bad, Angela Merkel can too. That means that she will be able to convince the German people, and that she herself is beginning to change the kind of austerity measures, dropping things like excessive taxes. So you don't have to continue with this measure. More than that, though, if you have the political capital to make this kind of policy decision happen, we have the political capital to change austerity measures. So then the last question is, how do we change Greece? And essentially they told us that you don't have a cycle of debt and that there will be a default anyway if we allow this to continue, so people aren't going to get their money back underneath the case. Look at what we told you. Firstly, we say that Greece is in no way self-sufficient. It cannot be isolated, and it cannot be alone, or it will fail. And this is really where they need to respond to. It needs capital, it needs loans, and it needs help from the other countries in the EU who you now alienate Greece from, and you prevent them from ever being able to access the capital that, if anything, was going to be their lifeline, and that was going to be able to save them. Because as an investor, when you make choices based on risk and reward, and you look at a country like Greece that has not been able to pay back its debts, and which has proved overwhelmingly to be risky, you're not going to take their line and give it to them anyway because you're generous. You're more likely to think like a smart investor and not invest in that country anyway. That means people on the ground have less access to money. That means that the pensioner now has nothing. So ultimately, lastly, we set the precedent for that country and for that government that they can continue to use irresponsible economic measures. This was also never responded to. So the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, we are better for Greece, we are better for the EU, we are better for the economy. Thank you.
Unwilling to engage with most of the analysis we wrote right from the start of this talk. But let's look at the two worlds that emerge anyway and see how individuals fare with this climate. So, the world of the opposition is a largely misinformed world, where their first two speakers based their entire case on a trend that did not exist, knowing eventually that Sri Pas unilaterally implemented austerity, they dropped this entirely by their word. We asked, what happened in the next election? How are you so sure that austerity will be the way out? No response. They were a world of concessions. Right from the start, they were willing to delay repayments by hundreds of years. Eventually it became, you get back your money bit by bit. Not sure how big these bits are, but they've never been very specific. They in fact ran an entire second speaker argument about how people hated austerity, somehow helping our case rather than hindering it. They were a world that lacked responses. The bulk of it came largely in turn in reply, a little bit difficult for us to answer them. But even then, we're largely missing the point. They spent about 1.5 minutes talking about the suffering of Greek individuals, which we told you was hurting in this way because of the human cost that needs to be considered. No response. We told you about debt spirals, how they make it worse because forgiving debt was the only way to escape a spiral of debt. No response. We told you, and this is important, because they missed the relevant comparative in this debate. They assumed the best of austerity, but that was never our claim. Our claim was simple. That the point at which UN made austerity is so bad, people would default. They only spent a whole of 40 seconds on this. And you know what they said? People will come to accept austerity because it's their only option. No, defaulting is the other option. That's why people will choose to default. And then they went this bizarre line, you will get your money back. No, defaulting by definition means you don't pay your debt. So you don't get your money back by defaulting. What we told you was that they incurred all the harms but none of the benefits. The point at which they failed to do with this comparative was the fall of their case. They were a world of suffering. They downplayed this by saying, people only suffer a little bit. And you know what? If the minimum wage is already too high, okay, you go tell that to the worker who's working on $5 an hour, and you want to tell him to cut it by half. You're going to really say, your minimum wage was too high, so I'm not going to make it so that you cannot even afford basic medication or food, because I'm also going to throw in 23% VAT tax. You've got to be kidding me. They are a world of suffering. In fact, many countries have a huge incentive to force Greece to leave. That is why Merkel is under so much pressure from the citizens to kick Greece out of the EU. No response. We asked an appeal one, would you abolish the EU labour market? And they gave a brilliant answer. No, but maybe. Okay, so this is a non-committal answer that somehow admits eventually that they don't even understand the basic principles of the EU. That is why you are willing to abolish every single institution of the EU because they contravene the principles on which it was founded. There was a ridiculous world. In the world of proposition, we were a world of certainty. We knew that forgiving debt creates trust and foreign direct investment across Europe, opening chains of supply. So, that is how we create the lifeline to save Greece, something that they harped a lot about in reply, but didn't really come out for the rest of this thing. We were a world that recognizes relevant moral duties. But we told you that Greek citizens were deceived into believing that pensions would not come at the cost of debt. No response. We told you that individuals chose to enter, knowing Greece's policies were, I quote them, unsustainable, and by the way, countries were already covering for their unsustainable policies. This simply means that they knew it was unsustainable and continued to let it anyway. We were a world that alleviates suffering. To allow Greece to stand on its own 2 feet, we knew that individuals needed to work on the minimum wage that would not compromise on their basic welfare, needed to work with pensions to ensure that even as they get old, they have a decent standard of living. We created a world that was livable, not one that was based on cold, hard economics like the world of the opposition. That's why we stood very proudly on the basis that the largest burdens fall on the broadest of shoulders.